And Jill, I'm curious, I'm sure you hear this constantly, right? People saying this ship has sailed in terms of the possibility, the idea of partition. But I heard you saying you feel like it remains, in your view, the only practical solution. So I'm curious if you can elaborate on that and ask it, and can you imagine something that could happen that would lead you to say, well, at this point now, I feel like this paradigm is no longer possible?
Yeah, there's a lot to talk about. So I can talk about that. I also do want to talk about to go back to I think where the conversation started in the ad and what partnership means. Um, okay, so I want to say that if the mediators sat down at the table, God willing, in some kind of multi-international mediation and came up with a different solution that was one state or three states or 12 states, whatever, like, and it would achieve the goals of ensuring that every person in that piece of land can have their human rights, can have their human rights and their dignity, and um, both as individuals and also as collectives, right? So both individuals and as peoples. If people come up with another agreement that both Israelis and Palestinians can agree to, like Zygazet. That said, um, in the current reality, yes, two states is much harder than it was 10, 30 years ago, or, you know, much harder than it would have been in 1947. That doesn't mean that it's impossible. And actually, it remains the most possible possibility, right? So other suggestions, if you're looking at two states versus, let's say, one state, Israel, Palestine, or whatever you're going to call it, with equal rights for everybody, that is not a solution that almost anybody on the ground wants. And also, when we think about, yes, two states is really hard, and it's not something that Israel certainly wants to accept. It's not something that Hamas wants to accept. The PA would accept it. Um, but you're talking about getting Israel to give up sovereignty over the occupied territories. I don't know what would lead anybody to think that a government that doesn't want to even establish two states would suddenly be willing to give up all of its sovereignty. Um, so that's the first thing that I want to say. And the second thing is that I do believe that Israel remains important as a Jewish state, as a place that always can be a refuge for Jews, which unfortunately the need for that has not gone away, that can be a center of Jewish culture, of Hebrew, um, a place where Judaism can flourish, that is also a democracy for all of its people, including the Palestinian minority. God willing, the state of Palestine would also be a democracy, including for minorities. But I don't see any possibility really that there would be that suddenly these two people are going to live together, right, kumbaya in one single state. Now, somewhere in between that, people talk about like, two states, one homeland, sort of the EU model of a state with open borders, right? We're still talking about two sovereign states, but with a higher level of cooperation, and that is also possible. But really, nobody is seriously talking about anything that is not along the two-state model, not in the Arab League plan, not in any of the other plans that have been negotiated. And I want to say also that October 7th, I don't think that there's almost any Israeli, certainly, um, who would say that October 7th heightened the desire to move toward one single state. And also you've seen it in Palestinian polling, right? Like it's up and down, but certainly two states in the polling that I've seen over the last couple of years. Actually, support for two states went way up a few months after October 7th in Gaza, but it still remains the most popular of any of the possibilities that are promoted. So I don't think that it's impossible. It is much harder than perhaps it used to be, but it is still the only reasonable plan that has international support, that has more support of more of the people in the region, and also that would allow both peoples to enjoy self-determination and to determine the God willing democracy of both states.
I want to bring in listen, but before that, I want to just ask, do you feel that there is any tension between the notion of liberal democracy, which is premised on the idea of equality under the law, and the idea of a Jewish state being a state that has some special obligation to represent and serve Jews, given that even in two states, not all the people in that country would be Jews.
We have a lot of states in the world, right? America is a little bit different because it wasn't created in the same way as a nation state, right? But we have uh, France or Germany or, right, like that we have any number of states in the world that define themselves as having special responsibility for the people who are members of that nationality. Now, what's different about, I think this is where sometimes things get confused, is that there is, Judaism doesn't fit nicely into a box. In the American context, we often talk about it as a religion because we're trying to fit it into the model of Western Christianity and trying to say, right, we have like the language of Judeo-Christian, which definitely doesn't mean anything, thrown around. And but within the American context, certainly there's this idea that Judaism is a religion and it basically affects where you are, that religion basically affects where you are on Saturday or Sunday or Fridays, right? Like what place of worship you go to. But Judaism doesn't really fit into that box, right? Because Jews are a people and a nation, right? Am Yisrael is the language that we use, and we have a homeland, and we have cultures, and we have languages, and we have sacred books, right? Like it's much more than a religious practice. We know that, very famously, when Napoleon was trying to figure out whether to expel the Jews from France, and the question was asked was like, are you a nation? Are you a religion? And smartly, in order to not get kicked out of France, the response that came from the Jewish community is we're a religion. So that was the right answer to not get expelled. But just historically, in terms of who Jews actually are, it's much more broad than just a religion. That's why, as probably most people know, you could never go to shul, you could never daven, you could eat bacon for breakfast every morning, and you're still 100% Jewish. Whereas it doesn't make sense to say, I'm Christian and I don't believe in, Jesus Christ as Lord and Savior.
But then how
Right?
does that connect to the question about
So Judaism is much broader. So when we're thinking about a Jewish state, for me, it's not any different than having a state that defines itself as any other kind of nation state. Um, Now, if we want to talk about a world plan in which we don't have any nation states and open borders, like, okay, that's another conversation, but that's not actually the world that we live in. And so something that we see around the world is there's actually, um, say, more breakdown between religious peoples, right? Like more breakdown within states that have maybe been shoved together, where you have people of different ethnic and religious groups that have been shoved together. So I don't see any contradiction, actually. I think that a Jewish state can define itself as Jewish, just as any state can define itself as any kind of nation state that it wants to be. And also, there is a responsibility inside of any nation state to be a democracy that ensures that that minority nations, minority peoples within that state have the exact same rights.
Thanks. So, Alyssa, I think what I hear Jill saying is that she sees Israel, or at least an Israel that no longer occupied, let's say, the West Bank and Gaza and East Jerusalem, a smaller in Israel that had Palestinian citizens, as being part of one of many different countries in the world that have some particular allegiance to a particular ethnic or religious group, and that whether it's countries in Europe, and we recognize that those countries are still liberal democracies. I'm just curious for you, what do you think about how do you think about this notion about about a Jewish state and whether it's compatible with liberal democratic principles?
Yeah, so I think I find it's hard for me to enter this conversation about the two states given the political reality on the ground right now. Like it seems like a very like so far from where we are and how much ongoing violence is actually happening as we're sitting here, both in Gaza as well as in the West Bank. And so I feel like there's actually like I'm having a like like an emotional but also like ethical problem engaging in a thing that seems like fantastical when there's a like an urgent crisis on the ground. That being said, I feel that it's important for me to say that what I understand is that the way that the Israeli state is functioning is in a state of Jewish supremacy, right? It functions as Zionism is like the religious and political belief that Jews have more right to that land than anyone else. And you can't have democracy and equality in that situation. And you also can't, in my opinion, carve out and around those values for Jews. You can't say, I value democracy and equality here in the United States, but it's okay that in Israel, Jews are afforded that and others are not, right? They're either for everyone or they're not, right? And so for me, it feels really, an expression of my Jewishness and my Jewish identity to say unequivocally that like I believe in the inherent equality of all people, Israelis and Palestinians. So anti-Zionism becomes necessary because it is anti-racism in the context of Israel-Palestine. And I think it's very often very scary to be anti things, right? It's certainly more compelling to speak of what we are for, right? But because of the immense violence that Zionism and the state of Israel has wrought and continues to wrought on Palestinians, it feels like you can't just be neutral to it, right? There is a putting our head in the sand.